As a homosexual killer of young men, Randy Kraft is virtually unparalleled in the number of people he murdered.
Randy Kraft was probably one of the most sadistic serial killers I've ever encountered.
He is charged with the murder of 16 men and is believed to have murdered over 60 men in a period between 1971 and 1983 in an area of California south of Los Angeles.
Wherever Randy went when he traveled for business, young gay men died in horrific ways.
Psychological criminologist and former FBI agent Dr. Brianna Fox is examining the red flags in his descent.
My work isn't just academic. I've been in the field and seen serial killers in action. I've tried to apply my experience to work out just how these seemingly normal people become the monsters they turned out to be.
Were there signs that he would descend into a spree of killings? And could police have caught the man known as the Scorecard Killer earlier and brought an end to his bloody reign of terror?
I'm Dr. Brianna Fox, and this is Descent of a Serial Killer.
Dr. Brianna Fox is examining the extraordinary case of Randy Kraft, who over a decade and killed many young men.
Alongside my fellow experts, I will be identifying and investigating the red flags in Kraft's descent into murder. Randy Kraft was born in Long Beach, California in March 1945.
Randy Kraft grew up in Long Beach, California, which is quite a lovely area. There are beaches there. It's a suburb of Los Angeles. It seemed that he had a pretty good home.
Dad had a good job. Mom did a lot of work at the school. She was very involved in the PTA, was always there. And Randy apparently was, an inquisitive kid by all indications.
At age 1, he was taken to the hospital with a broken collarbone. Soon after that broken collarbone, he fell down a flight of stairs. And then soon after that incident, he was reported to have had a head injury. Of course, it's a very thin line because we're looking at what is normal childhood behavior. Kids fall all over the place, and for the most part, they are resilient and their bodies recover very quickly. They're learning to walk, they're learning to navigate their environment. But we have to look at a rubric of what might indicate that something else is going on. That series of injuries in today's world would definitely be seen as a red flag for some kind of child abuse. We would want to send out Department of Child and Family Services to investigate what's going on in the home.
He was one of 4 children. He was the only boy, and apparently from all indications, he was doted on by his mother and his 3 sisters. His father, not so much.
The father worked a lot. He wasn't really in tune with his only son. And in fact, he actually preferred the girls in his family.
It's possible that he was just that kind of guy, or it may be that he noted psychopathy in his son very young, and that psychopathy simply turned him off, and he didn't like to be around him. Psychopathy usually appears by 5 years of age. There's already something wrong where that person, they have a rage toward everyone else. They want to manipulate them. They lie to them. They believe that they cannot succeed by being a good person, so they very early on decide to play a different game. Fathers tend to spot it early on. They know something's wrong and they get frustrated. But mothers, the doting type that mothers are, and sisters often just say, oh, he's just being a boy. That's just the way he is.
He was living in a part of Orange County, a city called Westminster. It's a small town, but in a larger, very conservative county within California.
very early on, you could tell that Randy was a very smart kid, very inquisitive, and he got very good grades in school, and he excelled in elementary school.
He was described by his childhood friends as being somewhere to the right of Attila the Hun. That's a very telling statement. We're talking about using a metaphor for someone that was a despot and killed thousands of people. And this is being reported by people that knew him as a child. So what was further revealed is that he was very rigid in his belief system and that he had a very quick temper.
As a schoolboy, Randy had a close, almost obsessive relationship with his mother. His relationship with his father was very different.
Mom was a real influence in Randy's life. They were church-going people. Mom was the main instigator in that, and that she and the sisters took a great deal of interest in Kraft when he was a young kid, especially when it came to schoolwork. And Mom was very, very active in the PTA, which played a huge role, I'm sure, in molding Kraft as a young student. As he got older, closer to the high school age, middle school, high school age, he had a little problem with authority, and he would question his teachers as to why he needed to do that. In fact, there was one instance where he asked a teacher, "Those rules don't apply to me." It didn't affect his grades because he got a very good GPA.
This is not uncommon when you have kids who are quite bright. When they're smarter than most of their classmates, their ability to get bored is pretty demonstrative. And when kids get bored, they get in trouble.
A lack of interest from his father could have driven a further need to stand out against his siblings in an attempt to regain his father's attention. His intellect gave him delusions of grandeur, which led to rule bending. He tested boundaries with his teachers and those in control to see when he would receive punishment. There is no conclusive proof that he was abused. I think the accidents would have been caused by his increased risk-taking behavior, reducing his inhibitions and the fear that other children would experience.
At school, Randy was something of a model student.
One name that was given to Kraft was Crafty Randy, and it was because many of his friends or people he met thought he was kind of slick. He was pretty good looking. And he obviously, if they're calling him crafty, I'm thinking he was pretty good at manipulating people. They sort of liked him, but he had his way with what was going on.
Kraft, in his latter years of high school, became very politically active, and he was willing to share his political beliefs with many of his friends.
He graduated 10th in his high school class at Westminster High School out of nearly 400, and he wound up getting a scholarship to a school called Claremont College, which is in the Pomona area. Those who know this education system in California, Claremont is one of the tougher schools to get into.
He went to Claremont College, which is also known to be a conservative institution, and he became very involved in supporting the efforts of the Vietnam War.
He comes into college essentially a staunch Republican, conservative, religious upbringing.
One of the things that had brought him into Claremont College was being part of a program called ROTC, which is Reserved Officers Training. And basically that's a way to get your school paid for, and then you make a commitment to the military afterwards. This really lent to his support of the Vietnam War and his support of a conservative candidate for president.
Randy Kraft was once asked why he was a conservative, and he said, "Oh, because that pleased my parents." Whether he really cared about what his parents thought of him is questionable, but a psychopath will always do something that benefits him.
Although Kraft's schooling was being paid for by the military, he got a job at a cocktail lounge.
And about this time, he got a job as a bartender. And it turns out to be it's a gay bar. And then people said that gradually they started seeing a change in him. He wasn't quite so Republican, he wasn't quite so conservative, and there were tendencies that he may be gay because of who he started hanging out with, the place he worked at.
It changed the way he appeared. He grew his hair out. It changed his actions. He became more party-driven and going out to bars and clubs.
His schoolwork suffers, his class attendance suffers, he gets more into the drug scene.
He starts to spend more and more time away from his place where he was living in college, disappearing for, days on end. His grades started to fall, and he became a different Randy Kraft.
A lot of the students said, watch out for that Randy guy, because if you hook up with him, he's kind of a sadist. He's kind of like likes to pick up young men and do things to them that are not so nice.
The one thing he started doing when he would disappear, he would have migraine headaches and tremendous stomach problems. And at this time, we are told that he started taking Valium like it was cough medicine or, like candy. Gobs and gobs of Valium to handle the headaches and the stomach. Back in those days, you couldn't come out of the closet. I mean, you were ostracized. That was the context of the time. Far different. We're talking, 50 years ago. A much different era.
In 1966, Kraft had his first brush with the law.
There's an incident during his junior year at Claremont Men's College where he solicits an undercover police officer for sex. This was the only contact he really had with law enforcement.
But because Kraft's record was clean, he had no record whatsoever, they didn't charge him.
Teenagers' beliefs and outlooks often evolve as they experience more personal freedom, attending university and being away from their family home. His changing attitude could have opened up new ways and ambitions in life. Randy Kraft has not yet exhibited any red flags that would have been picked up by authorities. His intellect allows him to articulate and manipulate others to get what he wants.
The following year, the changes in his personal life were reflected in his political allegiance.
At some point, he made a switch. He flipped over to being more on the left, was a huge supporter of Kennedy, and actually, campaigned for him, and was very distraught when he was murdered here in Los Angeles, when he was assassinated.
Remember, he was on a scholarship. He was gambling, staying out all night, cavorting around with friends and what have you, heavy drinking. The Valium got worse and worse and worse.
As a young adult, now in college, he is exploring the gay scene. He's out at gay bars, and it's probably around this time that he discovers the BDSM scene, bondage, discipline, sadomasochism. Most people that belong to the BDSM scene are not killers. They have rules that they operate by. It's a fantasy-based activity among consenting adults. But those that have darker fantasies will often experiment within that community. And what they find is that the fantasy is not enough, that the idea of enacting out scenarios with consenting partners is unfulfilling, and that they want more. And then these individuals that are not going to remain within the BDSM community and its rules will escalate into something different. They will morph into what's really going on with them, which is they have violent fantasies. They want non-consensual, sexual, predatory behavior to inflict upon victims that are non-consenting. That's what really turns them on. They are truly sadistic, and what turns them on, what sexually arouses them, is the suffering, humiliation, and degradation of other people.
A massive red flag here is his transgression of the consensual boundaries of BDSM, when his partner's consent is invariably violated by Randy's extreme behavior.
Because of his drug-taking and partying, Kraft's schoolwork falls so far behind that he needs to retake his senior year.
He then gets out of college, and he has to serve his time because he was in the ROTC program. And so he enlisted for his active duty with the Air Force. He winds up at March Air Force Base here in Southern California, out in the desert, Lancaster area.
One of the things that happened when he tested for the military is his intellect was off the charts. He was seen as a very intellectual individual, very gifted, and he was granted security clearance of a high level from his entry point into the military.
Then he makes an unexpected choice.
He let it be known that he was gay.
That didn't work out so well because at that time, being gay in the military was absolutely not accepted. Now, what happened was he was discharged from the military for medical reasons. So somebody might have been looking out for him. He didn't get a dishonorable discharge, he got a medical discharge. But this is where it seems that things took a turn for him.
After his discharge, Randy Kraft moved back into his parents' house.
His parents don't know that he had been arrested for propositioning a police officer. They had no idea of that. I don't think very many people knew that.
He didn't go back to school, he started bartending more, and he really immersed himself in the party lifestyle. And many of the people around him commented on his marked increase in alcohol use as well as amphetamines. As psychologists, as mental health workers, we look at the predominance of amphetamines in culture really as a scourge. It's problematic because more so than almost any other substance that is used recreationally, it can cause marked personality changes at a rapid pace, especially for those that are heavy and chronic users. One of the things particularly that happens with the use of amphetamines is a lowering of inhibitions, especially the more that's used. People become more immune to pain, they become more immune to sensation, they become more sensation-seeking as a result, and they can also really lose any insight or good judgment as to how their behaviors affect the world around them.
Eventually, his family finds out about Kraft's sexuality.
When he's about 24 years old, he decides to tell his parents that he's gay. And of course, this does not go well with his father, who is really outraged, can't believe that he would have a son who's gay. His mother was, I think, more accepting. She was disapproving. And of course, in her mind, she's thinking, well, maybe this is just a phase he's going through, that, you know, he can get through it.
His sisters blamed it on the fact that he went to an all-men's college, and they seemed to take the path of, we don't want to lose Randy, and that's what happened. He stayed with the family, they stayed in close contact, but it was at that point, according to his sisters, that Randy himself started to drift and started to lead a life that they had no idea was going on.
We've already learned about Kraft's unusual and sometimes bizarre childhood. The lack of interest shown to him by his father and over-involvement in his life from his mother created a need to stand out. His risk-taking behaviors, which caused accidents in childhood, have progressed into taking drugs and potentially dangerous sexual encounters.
What happened next was the beginning of a series of events that would define Randy Kraft as a deviant of the most dangerous kind.
His first victim was a 13-year-old boy that he met on the beach.
Kraft used marijuana, pornography, and pills to try to manipulate this young boy.
When he got him back to his apartment, he stripped the boy naked and raped him repeatedly.
At some point, the boy got away and ran into the street, and the citizens saw that and called the police.
He actually contacts the police and reports Kraft to them for basically abducting him. He was embarrassed about the sexual assault, so he didn't report it.
Police then make a terrible mistake.
For whatever reason, the police at the time, they entered the house without the warrant.
There was some evidence there that he was a sexual predator that the police had found. But because they didn't have a warrant, they couldn't do anything with it, and the case was dropped.
This close call seemed to give Kraft a shock.
When a victim escapes as Kraft experienced in 1970 with this 13-year-old boy who fortunately escaped likely death, a smart, organized serial killer like Randy Kraft is going to regroup. He's going to be freaked out by it. He's going to be watching to see if there's any news reports. He's going to cool it off for a while. And he's going to figure out, what did I do wrong? What do I need to do so that this doesn't happen again?
And if they're particularly intelligent, as in the case of Kraft, they use their intelligence to figure out a better way to perpetrate these crimes, a better way to lure their victims into these situations.
And he adapted by transitioning from marijuana and pills to more serious drugs like Valium in combination with alcohol, which is going to really place the victim at significant chemical disadvantage.
This was his first victim. It basically whetted his appetite for the kinds of brutality that he was to engage in later on.
In a contrasting choice, Kraft appears to try to further his education and find a reliable job.
Randy became a forklift driver and started going to Long Beach State, I believe, to get an education, and I think he wanted to be an engineer. He meets a 19-year-old kid named Jeff Graves. Graves would later tell investigators that Kraft would have a mysterious side to him, that he would take off and leave and not tell Graves where he went, and he'd be gone for a day at a time, sometimes 2 days at a time. He took a lot of Valium, took other drugs as well, and would have a tendency to kind of flare up and kind of lose his control of his emotions. That's what was happening in 1971.
On October 5th, 1971, the nude body of a 30-year-old man by the name of Wayne Duquette was found along what's called the Ortega Highway in Southern California. He had last been seen a few weeks earlier on September 20th.
This would become his first murder victim, and actually the first identification on his scorecard.
Duquette was a bartender at a local bar called The Stable, which catered to gay patrons.
He bound him up, he tortured him, he beat him, and then he dumped his body on the side of the road.
His body was in a condition where investigators couldn't determine an exact cause of death. In fact, they ended up ruling the cause of death for Mr. Duquette as alcohol poisoning.
His appetite for this destruction and torture and injury became stronger and stronger. And you could see this chronologically as more and more victims showed up as body dumps on the freeways in Southern California.
Body count is starting to multiply. There are now 14 victims in 4 separate counties over the past 3 years that investigators are trying to connect.
Randy had a hallmark of these behaviors of blunt force trauma to the face, of burning, of cutting, strangulation, forcing objects into the rectum or into the genitals. When the law enforcement would find these victims on the roadways, it became pretty clear which victims were Kraft's, although they didn't know it was Randy Kraft.
Kraft finds a new boyfriend and starts experimenting with multiple sexual partners.
In 1976, Randy Kraft hooked up with a guy named Jeff Seelig, and they became a couple. In fact, they would go out together and they would pick up hitchhikers and have a threesome. And Seelig again said that there were times when Kraft would disappear and act strange, but as far as he knew, the only time that Kraft had sex with anybody else was when he was with Seelig and they were having their threesome.
Kraft and Seelig end up moving in together in Laguna Hills, and at this point, Kraft goes on a bit of a halt in terms of his killing spree.
The man he was seeing joined him in couples therapy, They went to work on aspects of their relationship. The therapist, who later gave up his notes for the legal procedures, noted that Kraft was highly tense, anxious, tightly wound, and very concerned with his partner asserting any kind of dominance over him. He also commented that Kraft was hypersexual, had an insatiable sex drive that his partner could not keep up with.
Eventually, this timeout period would end by the end of 1976, and at that point, Randy Kraft started in again.
Vanishing for periods of time would normally arouse suspicion, but for a longtime addict, a drug-taking binge might be expected by his partner at home, so this would be less concerning. A monogamous relationship was not sufficient in fulfilling his needs because it was not sufficiently thrill-inducing. 14 potential murders over a 3-year period is a clear and rapid escalation in the severity and frequency of his offending. He must have felt at this point that he was able to get away with the violence and control-seeking behavior that he was beginning to find compulsive, a dangerous combination. The lack of clear red flags in Randy Kraft's descent is fascinating, but this may be because his relationship with his partner at that time was fulfilling a lot of the needs that he later had to act out on. When his relationship with former partner Jeff Sealing breaks down, Kraft starts to murder again.
By 1975, Kraft is working as a computer operator at Long Beach Airport. In March, he makes an error.
The exact date was March 29, 1975. A kid named Crotwell was last seen hitchhiking.
Unfortunately for Randy, he picks up Keith Crotwell, a 19-year-old victim, but there are friends of this hitchhiker in the area who basically see the car that their friend gets into, and then approximately 8 or 9 days later, Crotwell's head is found because Kraft decapitated him.
They reported to police what the car looked like, and then they actually found the car and told the police what car it was. And the police looked up the registration, and lo and behold, Randy Kraft. Guess what? Randy Kraft said, hey, you know, I did give the guy a ride, but he was alive when I left him. And that case never went forth.
The district attorney said, I don't have enough evidence in this case. I cannot file a murder charge against him. And Kraft, again, skated. He skated through.
That was not the only time Kraft escaped conviction.
In 1975, he also got picked up for lewd conduct and again, escaped without having to go to jail or anything.
Randy Kraft continues to kill wherever he goes. In fact, he would travel for work to Michigan and Oregon, and of course was in California, picking up hitchhikers and drugging and murdering them.
Kraft's MO for targeting his victims made a lot of organizational sense. He chose his victims by luring hitchhikers into his car.
One thing you don't want to do is pick high-profile people that are going to start a massive police investigation. And if you apply them with a lot of liquor and alcohol, liquor and drugs, it starts making the police think they kind of brought their own doom upon them.
He had, in Southern California, multiple opportunities to interact with very young men who were looking to get from one side of town to the other. So in combination with offering them a ride to where they were going, Kraft would often ply his potential victims with drugs and alcohol.
So they thought they were just getting a little happy with the liquor, but all of a sudden they were completely helpless because they had so much in their system they couldn't fight back. And by getting that kind of control, with them being helpless, he also suffered no injuries himself. So he wouldn't show up someplace and have, you know, cuts on his arms and bruises, and people would go, "What happened to you?"
In Kraft's story, I think we see something really complex because of the growing severity with which he treated his victims' bodies after they had died. It wasn't just sexually derived pleasure. It was about torture, about watching them die, and then about really disrespecting their corpses.
Randy Kraft was probably one of the most sadistic serial killers I've ever encountered. And oftentimes people, when they think of sadistic serial killers, they think of a male serial killer sadistically torturing a female victim. We hear about that all the time, but we don't realize many times that a male serial killer can also sadistically torture a male victim, and this is what he did. He did everything he could to watch them suffer. He burned them, he cut them, he emasculated them, he put objects in their private parts, both their penis and in their rectum. He just did anything he could to humiliate and harm them and watch them suffer.
These victims' final minutes were unimaginable in terms of the level of suffering that they experienced. When you start talking about ritualistic sadism, sexual sadism that is inflicted upon a victim for pleasure to the offender, that's a cognitive process. It's not really an emotional one. They are inflicting a fantasy that operates in their head that is very sexually arousing. So it's a fusing of sex and violence.
Kraft got rid of the bodies in a number of ways, but his most popular way was tossing them out of the car onto the highway. He became known as the highway serial killer at some point because so many bodies were found by the highway. This should have been a big clue to the law enforcement that there was a serial killer at work. He also did dump some of the bodies in national parks and at the beach. So depending on where he was and I guess what his needs were at the time, what was available to him is what he did. But a tremendous amount of them ended up on the side of the highway.
Kraft exploited his job to cross state lines to dump his victims, knowing that law enforcement agencies were unlikely to talk to each other and that the amount of victims he had taken would remain undetected. Decoding the scorecard must have been shocking for law enforcement officials as they finally get the truly gruesome picture of how many victims he had taken.
There appeared to be no end to Kraft's insatiable appetite for danger and murder. But even the most confident murderers make mistakes.
It was May 14th, 1983. Very early in the morning, Randy Kraft was driving, and he was driving erratically on the freeway, not far from the Marine base in Camp Pendleton, which is in the San Clemente area.
And the California Highway Patrol effect a traffic stop, and they pull him over for suspected drunk driving.
When they were able to pull the car over, Kraft emerged from the car, apparently stumbling drunkenly, with his pants unzipped, unfastened, and down around his waist.
He is cool, calm, and collected, comes out, acts like nothing big is going on. He thinks he's gonna pass the field sobriety test. He does not.
There was a man sitting in the front seat, and it appeared to one of the CHP officers that he was asleep and that he had, sitting up in the front seat, and he obviously had on a Marine uniform. And one of the officers kept looking and looking and looking and realized that this Marine was not breathing and he was dead.
On further investigation, the police discovered that in fact Terry Gambrell was not unconscious, but was actually deceased from wounds inflicted on him by Kraft.
He had been strangled. There were ligature marks around his neck.
They impound the car and they search the car, and they also search Kraft's apartment. And they find lots of incriminating evidence.
Law enforcement found a trove of pornographic Polaroids, many of them depicting Kraft in sexual situations with minors.
Many serial killers, particularly the more organized, brighter ones that are methodical, like Randy Kraft, will maintain trophies. They'll collect trophies and they'll document their murders, often writing down in code, what they've done. Kraft took trophies in the form of these Polaroids. He also, collected possessions of some of these victims. They're items of clothing and so forth.
They want that stuff because it reminds them of the wonderful time they had. Parts of their victims' bodies or their clothing or photos are their souvenirs. So once this is over, they don't have to just forget about it. They can actually, in the privacy of their own home, enjoy the memory of what their wonderful event was.
It's his way of memorializing these heinous acts he was perpetrating on these men and these boys. He can look at these Polaroids, he can masturbate, to those images, and it's a way of continuing the sexual stimulation and remembering it. Many will keep some form of record. Kraft had a notebook that he kept with codes in it for his past murders. And it was hard for investigators to glean from that notebook who was who, but it was in fact a way of him documenting some of his more favorite murders, if you will.
That notepad, the infamous scorecard, if you will, was just so eerie. And it had names, and it had dates, and it had little references of what happened and what he did. It was unbelievable that a human being could act that way.
They began to believe that he had maybe up to 67 people that he had killed. But there was this kind of funny situation where this one guy, McDougal, claimed that he was an accomplice, and that 67 was actually a low number. He said if the kill wasn't very thrilling, he just didn't write it down. He didn't note what he didn't think was very exciting. So, in other words, it was a bad date, so why record it?
And as police went through these cases and the date that was associated with them, they made a connection to about 46 different homicide cases.
The Orange County DA's office and respective agencies start to come together because there are other murders that seem to fit this pattern, particularly with what had happened to the victim, and they are piecing it together.
His brazen confidence when interacting with police, driving at an intoxicated level with a victim in his front seat are all escalations of his risk-taking behavior, a true display of arrogance.
Now, law enforcement must prepare for trial.
I do know that they spoke to hundreds and hundreds of witnesses.
There were other victims. In Oregon, there were victims that they identified in Michigan, because when they searched his property, they found clothing and jewelry and belts of men that they eventually identified to a number of other victims, specifically 2 victims that had been killed in Michigan. Wherever Randy went when he traveled for business, young gay men died in horrific ways.
There's a little bit of a neurological kink in most people's brains when it comes to collecting. Some people collect benign things, some people collect things that aren't so good for them. In the case of a prolific killer like Kraft, he is able to collect mementos from each one of his kills and relive the pleasure that he obtained, whatever that pleasure was. Maybe it was a sense of accomplishment in getting away with it. So each time he goes into his garage, he's able to see an entire panoply of everything that he's done.
The scorecard listed that as 67 people dead, but there was more than 20 bodies that had never been found.
In the long run, Randy Kraft was charged with 16 murders. Those are the murders that they had enough on him. They did come up with quite a bit of physical evidence and photo evidence to be able to charge him with those. For a long time, people have been trying to understand how a serial killer becomes a serial killer. And they're trying to come up with physical reasons that a person would do such horrific things. So they've done brain scans to try to show that the brain is different from a non-serial killer.
What they found in Kraft's brain scan is that the area of his brain that regulates rage, anger, and temper control completely abnormal. What's significant about this is we take those brain scan results and we combine it with his liberal use of methamphetamine and other substances, as well as the possibility of traumatic brain injury when he was a child, and we immediately know this is a dangerous combination. Kraft maintained his innocence against the overwhelming evidence of his crimes.
Randy Kraft's defense team argued that he had nothing to do with any of these murders. The state, on the other hand, introduced 157 separate witnesses and over 1,000 pieces of physical evidence as they built their case.
They had blood matching, they had fibers, they had pictures, they had everything, and it all rolled into a huge case.
On the 11th of August, 1989, Kraft received his verdict.
Randy Kraft was convicted on 16 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death.
He's now 75 years old. Whether or not he'll ever come forward and express the truth or what he did or his side of the story, if you will, that remains to be seen.
What were the red flags in Kraft's life that should have been picked up as warning signs of what was to come?
There were no red flags in Kraft's life that would have attracted the attention of law enforcement. He was smart enough to always remain on the edge, but within the boundaries of society.
One thing that really bothered me was when they finally put a task force together to find who this serial killer was. They brought on a psychologist who came up with this idea that the reason Randy Kraft did what he did, the reason he bit his victims, was because he didn't feel enough of a man and wanted to make the victims into a woman so he would feel powerful over them. And I'm thinking, where do they come up with these psychologists who say these ridiculous things? Because that is absolutely not what it was about at all. He was a gay man. He picked his victims because he liked having sex with gay men. It had nothing to do with females at all.
Could police have caught him earlier?
Law enforcement did have opportunities to stop Kraft, and each time he got away with his crimes, his arrogance only increased, resulting in him pushing his risk-taking behavior even further. It took law enforcement a long time to even identify that there was a serial killer, despite the graphic nature of the crimes and the similarities in victim type and disposal sites, which allowed him to continue for far longer than he should have been able to.
Judge McCartland at the time told Kraft, if you can give these parents some relief, if you can give them some information about the loss of their child, this could do well in your sentencing. It didn't make any impact on Kraft. He steadfastly maintained he had nothing to do with any of their disappearances.
Would the red flags have brought Kraft to the attention of authorities? And would he have been caught earlier if he was perpetrating his crimes now?
It would be far more rare to be missing for that long and not be noticed for 3 reasons. First, it's unusual to have hitchhikers anymore. Second, social media is far more prevalent. And third, CCTV use is a lot more widespread. So for these reasons, we wouldn't see people missing that long without being noticed. However, it's very possible that he would have been able to take forensic countermeasures and adapt his methods of killing to suit his needs. A scary thought.
It's been 50 years since Randy Kraft started his murder spree in 1972. And yet it almost seems like it's never gone away. I mean, they were so vicious, so brutal. These poor victims were either hitchhiking or just looking for a ride. Innocent kids, they weren't out looking for trouble. And to have all of these young men brutally murdered, tortured, it's still, I don't want to say it haunts me to this day, but it's something that I think about every once in a while.
My first exposure to Randy Kraft as a person happened way before the internet. I had moved out here to Los Angeles in the late 80s, and I was enjoying myself, the bar scene. And there were pictures and warnings. Watch who's giving you your drink. Be careful who you go home with. Make sure that people know where you're going because there's a killer on the loose.
Randy Kraft's high IQ meant that he never raised typical red flags along his descent, so he was able to continue to commit serial murder unchecked. The biggest red flag should have been when he progressed outside of this consensual BDSM, but as a private act, this was never brought to law enforcement's attention, so they were never aware of it. Randy Kraft was convicted of 16 murders, but law enforcement suspect the true number is far higher. Without a confession, we will never know.